Well, on Monday, acting Johannesburg Mayor Kenny Kunene and his team raided buildings in the city of Johannesburg that are illegally occupied and believed to be criminal hubs that impact the city's revenue collection programs. During these raids, the team conducted searches and even demolished one building in Windsor East. That was caught on camera. There's been mixed reaction to this, with some supporting this move by Kenny Kunene and officials. Let's get your reaction now from SERI, the Socio-Economic Rights Institute of South Africa. We're joined this morning by its Executive Director, Nomzamo Zondo. Nomzamo, it's great to see you. Thanks very much indeed for coming on. A political power play, point scoring, or a necessary action? What do you make of it?
Definitely political point scoring, but also coupled with unlawful and criminal activity. Because in this country, it is unlawful to evict someone from their home without a court order. Once you start demolishing a building, people living inside it, you're actually evicting them. That's a criminal offense in terms of the PI Act. It's already unlawful in this country. People who live even in unlawful occupation are protected by the Constitution and by the PI Act. Definitely not a necessary action. There are some necessary actions that I can speak through during this interview of what the city should be doing around housing in the inner city, and what the acting mayor did on Monday was definitely not that. Yeah,
let's get to that in a second on the necessary actions, but I want to talk more about the legal aspect involved in what Kenny Kunene and his team did on Monday. All of these searches that were conducted, the threats of evicting residents, that building that was demolished in Windsor East, it was all done without a court order.
Exactly. In fact, in 2021, the Constitutional Court handed down a judgment in a matter involving the city of Johannesburg, the Department of Home Affairs, and the South African Police Service, where they had been doing the exact same thing under the leadership of Mayor Mashaba. And the court then was clear that actually when it comes to somebody's home, that part of the world is sacrosanct. People should feel safe in their homes, and the only way you're entitled to raid and search their homes is if you have a court order, if you have a warrant, or if you're acting under the Criminal Procedure Act. As we saw in these raids, the police weren't even there, so we can't even allege that maybe they suspected that there was some criminal activity and they were trying to stop it, and couldn't do that without first approaching a magistrate for the warrant. So clearly, what we see here is the city raiding people's homes almost as an act of intimidation. I mean, the fact that both the MMC and the mayor, acting mayor, in their speeches addressed how people who were living there were paying rent, that people who were living there were victims of their landlords, yet their solutions were solutions that would make those people homeless. I mean, there was a threat that the Parkland building will be locked up at 9 o'clock the next morning. Similarly, in Windsor, as all of us saw, they started demolishing a building where there were curtains and people could even be seen inside. All of those actions happened without a court order, and as I explained earlier, were actually in fact criminal. I think the threat of eviction in this moment, especially in the city's own failure to address the issue of affordable housing in the inner city of Joburg, is really irresponsible. What we needed, one is we definitely need a city that's concerned about people living in inhabitable conditions. So I think at the first task, if the city is concerned about the conditions that we're living under, that's great. The question is that what should they be doing about it?
Yeah,
and there are a few options in the MMCs that accompany the acting mayor. There was the MMC for Human Settlements, who should be aware that the emergency housing program of the National Housing Code enables the city to apply for funds to assist people living in exactly such circumstances. So in effect, we shouldn't be having her leading the charge of trying to evict people. We should be having her trying to find a way to make conditions in those buildings better, using public funds.
Yeah, there's a comment that the acting mayor also made about the size of the rats in one of the buildings. It was an exercise in hampering the dignity of the residents of those buildings, right? And this is an already vulnerable group of people who have suffered over many, many years under the course of other mayors. You mentioned Herman Mashaba.
Look, unfortunately, the tactic of raiding in Johannesburg is a tactic that's as old as I think even 2 mayors before Mayor Tau. So it's a tactic that every now and again keeps getting recycled. It is of course phenomenal that the acting mayor on his first day of service thought that's the solution. Unfortunately, it's something that keeps recurring, and unfortunately it doesn't solve the problem. All it does, it makes people feel insecure. Who, as I said, it shows that actually criminality isn't just being propagated by drug lords or being propagated by people who are unlawfully collecting rent from people who are in unlawful occupation, but the criminality is actually being perpetuated by the city, who instead of addressing the housing crisis, attacks the very people that are the victims of that housing crisis. Because I mean, it was amazing. I think even for the acting mayor to say at least under Mayor Mashaba's time, Mayor Mashaba just simply claimed that he's raiding these buildings because because undocumented migrants live in them. This time, acting Mayor Kenny Kunene said these buildings are homes to South Africans and foreign nationals, and we know this, and we know they are paying rent. In fact, what was amazing for me was the fact that they hadn't done any due diligence. They didn't even know whether services are being paid. They told us as the public that residents are telling us that the services are not being paid. You are the city of Johannesburg. You are the one that services are being paid to. Secondly, they were asking who's the owner. The city of Johannesburg has a system that records who owns which piece of land. Even beyond that, they have access to the deeds office and can be able to pull that information directly. So instead of coming to us with all of this unresearched information, they could have actually just come and said, we know the owner of this building is this person. I mean, the one thing that really infuriates us is the fact that they keep throwing this word around, hijack. If you hijack buildings, then you mustn't expect to live in peace. Hijacking is a legal term. It's a legal term that comes from the PI Act. It's a legal term that refers to people who collect rental for unlawful occupation. In South Africa, because of our past, people who live in unlawful occupation are protected, first by the Constitution, secondly by the PI Act. You can't antagonize, victimize people who live in unlawful occupation as a government purely because of that, because then that really spits at the face of our Constitution. It spits at the face of commitments that we have made to make sure that the landless black majority has secure homes.
Yeah, absolutely. Just indirect sort of ignorance, what it looks like on the face of it, of what the court has to say, the exact issues that you've just outlined, that these residents are protected by the country's constitution, and that these raids, in effect, were the things that were illegal, not the people living in these buildings. You talked, Nomzamo, at the beginning of our interview about the kinds of resolutions we need to try and deal with the housing crisis in the inner city. This is a problem that's as old as probably the inner city is, right? The illegal collection of rent in the inner city, etc. What can be done? I'm getting a lot of flack already on social media because there are a lot of people tweeting me saying, these are the kinds of buildings that are responsible for the levels of crime in the inner city. These people need to be evicted from the inner city. What is your response to the solutions here that are available? And you've already spoken to some of them.
Sure. So I think the first thing, as far back as 2014, we, as SERI, we published a report called Minding the Gap. And we're pointing out the fact that people who as I think one of the residents interviewed by the acting mayor, are paying 1,000 rand a month, can't be catered for in the private property market, can't be catered for even in the social housing market. And there is a need to develop public housing solutions to cater for such people. If you lock people out of legal access to housing, then you are actually feeding and growing the unlawful solution. So if you want to address bad buildings, you don't do it by attacking people that are living in those bad buildings. You create options where they can go and they can be in lawful occupation and options that they can afford. That's the first thing. And as I said, it's something that we've been saying for over 10 years, engaging the city, engaging even national government on. Two, as I explained, similarly, I think the one thing the city has is the power to enforce. The fact that the acting mayor could refer to the emergency management services, but there are other departments in the city whose duty is to make sure that the environment that we're living under is safe. And in fact, they are able to call to book property owners for failing to provide living conditions that are fair in the buildings. And as I said, thirdly, in cases where they can't find those property owners to hold them accountable, they have available to them a route where they can access funding through the provincial government under the emergency housing program, and to actually manage the conditions that we are living under.
Correct.
I don't think it's right, Michelle, if people are saying on Twitter, and I'm sure they are, they're saying people must be evicted from the inner city. If people know what the inner city looked like in the late 90s, in the late 80s and the early 90s, it looked like that because black people were excluded from it completely. Some of the people that Seri represents started living in the inner city unlawfully, sometimes renting from property owners in the late 80s, in the early 90s. It was with capital flight from the inner city that the buildings became derelict. And even now, instead of engaging the people living in the buildings, we want to talk about the buildings. But the people living in the buildings are not going to stop living in them. In fact, what happens is that every time people think we'll close this Mnyamandao, another one appears somewhere else. In fact, even if we look at the last 5 years, what has happened is that you actually now have informal settlements within the inner city, exactly because people have been pushed out of where they've been living in the inner city. And the one thing about the inner city is that it's the one place that enables people not only to live, but also to make a living. So people who are working as informal traders, sometimes people who are working as taxi operators, are living in the inner city because it allows them access to
economic
livelihood opportunities that they will normally not have. So I think having said that, I think the one thing that people always forget is that the reason the city looks different is because the city was designed so that the majority was completely locked out of it.
I think your point is well made, Nomzamo. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I absolutely hear what you are saying. And perhaps it's time that the acting mayor speaks to organizations like Seri instead of doing raids for the sake of cameras. Nomzamo Zondo is Seri's executive director. Thanks very much for joining us this morning.